The EPA calls for major changes to how the state regulates water quality on Vermont farms. Plus, an update on efforts in the Green Mountain State to build out broadband access. And an urgent care center for mental health crises opens in Burlington next month. That and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It is Friday, September 13th. And joining us on the panel today, we have Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Elodie Reed from Vermont Public, and joining us remotely today, Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here today. We've got kind of a hodgepodge of topics today. They're all really interesting, and we'll get right to it. Starting with you, Kevin. The Environmental Protection Agency has called on Vermont to change the way it regulates water quality on farms. What are they specifically talking about here? What kind of changes might have to be made?
Sure. Well, this has been a long time in coming. The Environmental Protection Agency has been investigating how Vermont regulates pollution off of farms in the state for almost a year. The Conservation Law Foundation last year said, hey, we don't think that the state of Vermont is doing enough to prevent waste from flowing off of farms into the waterways of the state. So, hey, EPA, you guys should really look into this. This is a problem. And so the EPA did an investigation and basically concluded that the state needs to clean up its act. It said, look, you guys are not doing enough to make sure that the waterways of the state of Vermont are prevented from having manure, essentially, from flowing into it. And that's a big problem for the state. And so they basically concluded that the regulatory structure that Vermont has is just fundamentally flawed. Now,
that's interesting because it's the way it's being sort of overseen, I guess, is the problem. Right. The Agency of Natural Resources, I think the EPA, correct me if I'm wrong, is saying they really know the most about this and they should have the oversight of it, but that's not exactly what's happening, right?
That's right. So in Vermont, ever since the Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, the state has been allowed to regulate how that law applies to the state. And in terms of farms, state agencies have divided how they regulate pollution off of farms. You have the Agency of Agriculture, which says, no, we know a lot about farms and how they operate and how many cows are here and what kind of permits are necessary. And then you have the environmental regulators in the Department of Environmental Conservation who know a lot about other kinds of water pollution in other places. And so they share responsibility for making sure that the pollution from Vermont farms is managed properly. But what has happened is that over years, there's been a lot of tension between those two departments about who knows best, who knows who's in charge, and what the solutions ought to be to the pollution that is discovered.
But aren't they working for the same goal? Yeah. I mean, why can't they work together on this? What's the problem?
That's a little tricky. I mean, apparently it has a little bit to do with jurisdiction, right? I mean, who's in charge, or do you really want, another group of regulators coming in and, stepping on your turf, essentially? And one of the observations some people have made over the years is that they feel that the Agency of Agriculture has a bit of a conflicted role here by virtue of promoting the dairy industry in the state of Vermont and then also regulating the pollution that comes off those farms. So the EPA basically agreed with the Conservation Law Foundation that this bifurcated structure, this overlapping jurisdiction, is a problem. It needs to be fixed. It gave the state 90 days to come up with a solution. And the threat that it held out there over the state's head is, if you don't fix this, we will come back in and we will regulate the pollution off of farms. And by implication, you're not going to like it.
I don't think either would like that, the ANR or the Agency of Ag. But what would happen? Let's say the 90 days goes by and they come up with a plan that the EPA says, this isn't getting it done. And I guess my biggest question is it going to be a situation where, because the Conservation Law Foundation thinks the Agency of Natural Resources should be completely involved or completely in control, is that a possibility where the ag could be taken out of it completely?
Yeah, I think what is likely to happen is that the Agency of Natural Resources is going to is going to propose something to the regulators at EPA. And they're probably not going to say, okay, you're right, we're really horrible at this, we're going to consolidate it into one department and do everything as you describe. They're probably going to come up with a half measure that says, okay, well, what if we do it this way? What if we structure it this way? What if we increase the number of permits that we require some big farms to get? What if we do that? Will that resolve your concerns? And if those types of half measures don't resolve the EPA's concerns, then they're really going to have to look at doing something more substantial. And it would be potentially a wholesale restructuring of the way that regulation of dairy's pollution in the state is conducted, and it would have to be, according to the letter from the EPA, under a single agency, and that would be the Agency of Natural Resources.
This is tough for dairy farmers too, isn't it, Kevin? Because
Absolutely.
you know they're trying. They know for years a lot of fingers get pointed at them for a lot of the pollution problems that we hear about. Specifically, right now, and you've been writing about this, biosolids on Vermont farms are becoming an issue. Can you sort of explain what that is, what these biosolids are, and what the problem seems to be?
Sure, and this is a related but different issue, right? Okay. Because what we were just talking about is the pollution that flows off of fields and barns and ponds of cow manure. That's essentially what the problem is on those farms. But the other problem that we have recently realized, the state is kind of coming to grips with, is the fact that a lot of the fertilizers that farmers are spreading on their fields come from wastewater treatment sludge. And that is coming back from some new test results showing that there's contamination in that sludge. Now, we need a little bit of explainer here what we're talking about.
Sure.
Wastewater treatment plants are the places where all the waste from all the communities that they serve gets concentrated, and then the waste material, human waste material, is stripped out through various chemical processes and biological processes, and it creates this thick, nasty sludge that you have to do something with while the clean water goes into the river. Hopefully the clean water goes into the river. And so there's a huge volume of this material, and the question is, well, what do you do with it? And for years and years and years, decades really, the state of Vermont, and it's rural state, and farmers say, well, that is something that actually could be reused in a beneficial way. It could be spread on fields. It would allow farmers to not have to go out and pay for chemical fertilizers, and it will give the communities with this waste material a place to put it other than a landfill.
That all sounds good. I feel there's a catch coming.
There is absolutely a catch, because just like the human waste is being concentrated in these wastewater treatment plants, also the chemicals in our environment are being concentrated there too. And a particular kind of chemical that everyone is starting to learn a lot more about in recent years, called, we'll just shorthand it to forever chemicals. These very durable fluoride-based compounds that don't break down. Degrade and break down in the environment and sunlight and wind and heat. They just stay there and they build up. They build up in your body if you're using a product that's made with PFAS. They build up in the waste, and they build up in the soil. So Vermont started to do some testing about 5 years ago, and they realized, wait a minute, the places where we're allowing to be spread this fertilizer, this sludge on farm fields, when we go and test that soil, elevated levels of PFAS.
Oh boy.
So regulators say, well, yeah, it's not great, but it's not horrible. Like, it's not as bad as Maine, or it's not as bad as Texas and Michigan. The New York Times just did a big investigation a couple weeks ago, which is what caused us to write a story about this in Vermont, that it's really bad in some places where there's large cities with huge volumes of this material, and they've just for decades been putting sludge on farms in high concentrations. It's coming back with really alarmingly high levels of these chemicals in those fields. Vermont does not have that bad of a problem. Vermont is not a very an industrial state, essentially, and so the levels in the soil, environmental regulators say, are manageable. If you keep it away from wells, if you keep it away from riverbanks, if you are smart about how you apply it and don't dump it all in sort of huge amounts in a certain concentrated areas, then it's something they still want to allow to be done. But environmental activists are just beside themselves. They're like, why would you possibly continue to allow contaminated sludge to be spread on our precious agricultural fields. And so the practice is coming under greater and greater scrutiny. There's an ongoing debate about it. And I think the end result is this is going to be harder and harder and harder to do in the state, given the new scrutiny that regulators are bringing to it.
Briefly, Kevin, before we move on, the problem seems to me that it has to go somewhere. Absolutely. If they're not going to be spreading it on the fields and they're saying, where is it going to go? It has to go somewhere.
This material goes 3 places in the world, generally, or in New England, let's say. It goes either in a landfill, it goes to be spread on farms, or it gets incinerated. And Vermont regulate, not really in Vermont so much, Connecticut and Rhode Island and those places tend to just throw it in a waste-to-energy plant. Vermont has been very hesitant to ban the use on farmland because they know that since we don't have any waste incinerators in Vermont, that's almost certain to go to the Coventry landfill. Coventry landfill, there's only one left in the state. It's filling up fast. There's all these other demands. Why would we take a perfectly good waste material that could be benefiting our farmers who need all the help they can get in many ways and truck it dozens and dozens of miles, depending on where you are in the state, to a landfill where you pay all this money, right? The community has to pay the money to send it there. It goes in the landfill and it's just sitting there. And then actually, after heavy rainfall, right, it's slowly leaching out in the bottom of these landfills, and then they have to deal with that leachate, they call it. So There's no perfect solution. Regulators think that spreading it on farmland, on balance, is still the best way to go.
Well, I sure appreciate you explaining all that because it's been a long-going problem here in Vermont. And we're going to shift now to another issue that's something that Vermont has been grappling with for a long time. And Howard Weiss-Tisman, you have been reporting on this for a while, and that's getting everybody connected to high-speed internet, the broadband build-out. There has actually been some good news on this with some money coming in. What can you tell us about the latest on broadband?
Sure. Well, there's a lot of good news. This has been going, lawmakers wrote the legislation almost 10 years ago that set up these CUDs, these communication union districts, which are groups of towns that are working together to lay this high-speed fiber network where for-profit companies weren't willing to do it because it never made economic sense in Vermont. So the CUDs have been working. They're really making progress across the state to varying degrees. What we learned this week is that the Vermont Community Broadband Board is going to use about $4 million to do what they're calling a long drop program. And what that's going to do is when houses are within 400 feet of the high-speed fiber network, they can get connected. But if they are deeper in the woods, or this is a problem at manufactured mobile home parks that they have to be laid underground, it's very expensive. It could be up to a couple $1,000s per household. So what the state announced this week is that they're going to use this money to help these folks concentrating on low-income customers to help them hook up to the high-speed fiber network. And the reason this is important for a lot of reasons, obviously, to hook up houses, it's important, but it's a really important part of the economic model that they're building. So if these CUDs are spending all of these millions of dollars to lay this high-speed fiber network along the highways and no one hooks up to it, they're going to be in worse shape than they are. So really, every single household that gets hooked up kind of benefits the whole economic model. So they're going to put together this long drop program, invest $4 million, and hopefully, the state says there's at least 1,000 addresses across the state that can benefit from this, probably more. So hopefully they're going to be able to do that.
And that 1,000, I'm sorry to interrupt, Howard, but that 1,000 or so, you're talking about a lot of those folks being further away, as you were explaining before, than that 400 feet. So it would be very difficult for them otherwise to get hooked up to the high speed.
Right, expensive and difficult, and that's what this money is going to do. And this is coming just as Vermont's about to get another pot of federal money on Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or BEAD money. Vermont's gotten about $200 million from the federal government to get this moving, and this BEAD money is just about to hit the state. The state is just putting together the application program. Yeah, that graphic we're looking at.
Yep.
is like, if you consider this two parts, that's kind of the first half of the build out. So the state spent $206 million. They're about to get another $229 million. So it's really working. They are doing this. There are skeptics that are wondering what the long-term economic viability of this all is. But for now, they're spending a lot of money and they're laying a lot of fiber, and households are getting hooked up.
Great to get some good news. And Elodie Reed, I think you may have some good news too when it comes to helping people that are suffering through mental health crises. Burlington is going to get an urgent care center for mental health crisis opening, I believe, next month. Explain what this is exactly, and when I say urgent care, I think that's a little bit different than what we may consider or think about when we think about a mental health care center.
Yeah, so it's going to open October 28th at 1 South Prospect Street in Burlington, and it's really built as an alternative to the emergency department at UVM Medical Center. 4 different organizations, UVM Medical Center, Howard Center, Pathways Vermont, and community health centers all came together and said, you know, we need to come up with a different solution because there were up to 20 people waiting for an inpatient bed at UVM Medical Center a couple summers ago. And so, along with some funding from the Department of Mental Health, they are opening this urgent care center specifically for mental health crises. And the idea is that it's where people can go if they're not having some sort of like acute medical issue or needing inpatient psychiatric care. And they're essentially saying, like, you should just come. And if we can't provide you the care you need, we'll get you where you need to go, and we'll make sure that you get handed off to where you need to be. And
some of your reporting, too, has mentioned that folks who perhaps don't have English as a first language, they don't have to worry. They will be helped out as well.
Yeah, they're really emphasizing access, so they'll have interpreters on hand if English isn't a language you speak. They are welcoming people who have substance use issues, who might have intellectual disabilities, basically complex needs is how they put it. And they're especially wanting the center to be somewhere where people can go if they're struggling with suicidal thoughts. They're looking at it as an extremely accessible, warm and welcoming, non-stigmatizing place. So if people are having those thoughts, they can go and they'll be provided care by people who are trained specifically to respond to that.
I mean, there's so many good things about that and helping people out, taking some of the pressure off as well from the big medical center too, as you said. And I was surprised to learn this is not the first kind of place in Vermont, though. In Burlington, yes, but there are some other places that have already been operating, right?
There are, yeah. There are 3 others. One's in the Northeast Kingdom, one's in Addison County, one's in Washington County. And from researching them a little bit, they're like kind of like a living room. Like they're not a sort of like clinical medical facility, right? And that goes back to the idea of stigma being the reason why people often don't seek out mental health treatment. And these centers are really working towards getting around that and helping people get the care they need.
Something else you've been reporting on, and I think people can relate to this given the presidential debate we just saw. Immigration obviously is a big issue. And you know, a lot of news was made too, talking about getting back to the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was kind of a disaster when it happened for a lot of different reasons. But Vermont is now calling for green cards for some Afghan refugees. These are folks who helped out the United States in a really, really dire time. I'm guessing they're interpreters, other people that were helping out. Tell us about this call for advocates are calling for these green cards for Afghans.
Yeah, so back in August, it's the 3-year mark since Kabul fell to the Taliban and the U.S. government fell. And once that happened, anyone who was working with the United States, who set up that government, was no longer safe. And so, you know, I don't know if I'm sure you remember the images of people just fleeing, you know, crowding into airplanes.
Yeah.
600 of those people ended up in Vermont. And so I was at this press conference, and there are a lot of different people there with different perspectives on this immigration here. And everyone basically said, Vermont has been so welcoming, from employers to community members to the state government, to these people. And Basically, what advocates were saying is, you've been so welcoming, now continue your work by advocating for this policy. It's called the Afghan Adjustment Act, and it would give green cards to these people who are no longer safe in their home country. Right. They helped the U.S. At the moment, they're here on a humanitarian parolee status, which there's no path to lawful immigration from that status. And so it's basically giving these people who are kind of in limbo right now a path to making this.
Is that what the green card would do, is give them that path to a more permanent, stable home?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And were a lot of them settled in the Rutland area? I'm trying to remember where a lot of these Afghan refugees came.
That's a good question. I don't know that I actually know the map of the state, okay. But certainly two of the people who came here, they're female judges, and there's actually been a special effort by former Judge Patricia Whelan to get female Afghan judges out of the country.
I remember that story,
yeah,
yes.
There's been this long-standing relationship, this cultural exchange that started happening like way back in 2004, and they maintained those connections. When Kabul fell, Patricia Whelan got in touch with her other fellow judges from around the world and said, what's happening? How can we get these women out? And like you said, it was kind of a mess. The U.S. government admits that. Yeah. And so Patricia Whelan and these other judges kind of just figured it out from their kitchen tables. And they, as of that press conference in August, they had evacuated 215 women judges from Afghanistan with their families. There's over 1,000 people. And they had 39 more to go, but they expected to get all of them out. And two of those judges were at this event and have been resettled here. Oh,
that's extraordinary. I love good news. Kevin McCallum, let's turn back to you. There's more good news. And I want you to sort of recap a story for us that, may have seemed amusing at first. I'm not sure that's the right word. Let's go back to what some folks were calling Watergate, wet bagging. Who were the two Vermont lawmakers involved in this incident? What has happened since, with an ethics panel getting involved?
Sure. I think the word that generally comes to mind for me when reporting on this incident is bizarre.
Okay,
right.
Fair enough.
It is amusing, but it's also bizarre. Basically, you had a situation where two lawmakers were in some sort of a dispute in the legislature this session, and one of them, Mary Morrissey of Bennington, was caught red-handed on a spy camera pouring water in her colleague's tote bag outside
over and
this
over
committee.
again.
Over and over again. And the lawmaker, Jim
Carroll.
Jim Carroll, yeah, told his colleagues and friends that he didn't understand why his bag was wet every day, and it was driving him nuts. And so he set up this camera, and he found that his colleague, also from Bennington, was secretly pouring water in his bag. Now, we don't really know why this was happening, what her motivation was, but it was a huge story. Everyone couldn't believe it. There was video evidence of it that got released because this just whole thing was shared with the police department there in Montpelier, and so we asked for the records, and we got the records, and sure enough, there's the video that shows her doing it. The ethics panel in the House was forced to sort of look into this and try to get to the bottom of it. And you could tell that they really just wanted to put this behind them, right?
Sure.
It's been a few months. They got a lot of bad publicity. They got these two in a room, and they tried to have a type of restorative justice with them to say, look, can you apologize for what you did? How did this make you feel? What's going on between the two of you? And so they put out a press release a couple of weeks ago that said, we're done with this. It's over. She's apologized. It was embarrassing. It kind of negatively reflected on the integrity of the legislature or the House of Representatives. So I think they're just happy to have it behind them.
Yeah, normally they'd probably deal with this internally, but because it made national news, they probably felt like they had to issue this press release, say everybody's friends now. Okay, thank you for updating us on that. It is almost October, my favorite month. Howard, that means leaf peeping season is coming up in Vermont. That's always a good time for tourism, but there are some concerns. What are those concerns?
There are concerns. Yes, breaking news. Foliage is coming. We can announce that here this week. The Department of Tourism puts out a really cool interactive map that will show you where they're expecting foliage to be throughout time. You can kind of move it back and forth. They're saying that peak is expected right around October 10th. Some of the news coming out of this is that they are expecting colors to be really good this year. Last year, all of that rain created a lot of fungus on the trees and it kind of muted the colors. They're not seeing that this year. Some of the other things important to talk about is after the flooding this year, a lot of towns are kind of walking this fine line. Towns in the Northeast Kingdom, Lamoille County, they're saying, we're open for business. We want you to come, but you should check out where you're going before you're setting down some dirt roads. Some of the flood impacted roads are still closed or being worked on. So they're not chasing people away. These tourist dollars are so important to some of these small communities. So Vermont is open for business. We're open for foliage, and we want you to come, except, of course, that one road in Reading, which we have reported on, Jenny Road, which is one of the most photographed roads in the state of Vermont. The select board there is once again closing that down to tourists because the folks that live on that road say it's just gotten out of hand.
Okay.
This social media viral thing where there are just thousands of photos of this one road, this one farm. So Jenny Road in Reading is closed, but the rest of Vermont is open.
Want to make a quick note that we are remembering Lydia Clemens, 101 years old, Elodie, Lydia, I'm sorry. And yeah, that's a Vermont icon, really.
She is, yeah. She was 101 years old, and just from the people I spoke to, she, at Clemens Family Farm, both she as an individual and the farm and the legacy it has, just created a refuge for Black people in Vermont and still does. And a pretty incredible legacy.
And we're going to have to leave it there this week. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Kevin McCallum, Howard Weiss-Tisman, and Elodie Reed. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Thank you so much for tuning in to Vermont This Week, and we'll hope you see you again next week.